questions, so apologies for the slight delay. I understand from colleagues that this was the case last time as well, so it seems there's a bit of a trend here in terms of accessible technology. So we are working through that issue at the moment, and hopefully we will have the projector up and running shortly. But in the meantime, we thought we'd get started and make sure to give you the full time that we have allocated with our expert, who, as you will know, is a former BBC journalist, very well respected in the field, and we're really delighted and pleased that David has found the time to join us for a second time and to give you some more details around how to make the most of media opportunities, particularly now as we're getting closer to some potential resolutions on text, and then of course the summit in September, so many of you will be planning ahead for your media engagement. So I think that's it from our side. Hand over now to David.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear and see me? Yeah, that's great. And we will also be able to hear and see a few other things as we go through the afternoon. As Ollie has said, I'm here for the second time, and I know I've met some of you before, but I haven't met all of you before. Can I just have a quick show of hands as to who is here in April, on April the 20th, when we were in this room? Okay, that's great. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for coming back. That's a massive vote of confidence that I'm taking there. Thank you. The good news for you is that we're not going to repeat the same thing again, and the good news for everybody else is we're going to revise the things that we did in April, which means that we will cover the important aspects of what we did over the last session and also in this one, of course. And I should just say that my own background is I run a training business. I do a lot of work with people who work in charities and international NGOs. And my main aim is to help people communicate better when engaging with the wider media. And through the media, of course, a wider audience. A lot of my work is done with specific charities. So I tend to work in groups of 2 or 3 people, where we'll spend an afternoon or a day, and we will talk about what we mean by being interviewed, perhaps how you interviewed on television and radio, what do you think about? And a lot of that information and a lot of the tips that we use, we have distilled in my work for Civicus. Some of you will already know about this publication or this document, which you can find online. We will give you the full details of how to find all the information about how to engage with the media as part of this program of events and also work online websites to do with the engagement with the media. And there's a website which you should have a look at, the Sustainable Development 2015.org website, and we will be plugging that towards the end as well. But the reason I'm holding this is a PDF version, which you can download as well from the online site. The online site is really your resource for everything that we're going to talk about today. It splits up engagement with the media into a number of different sections, about a dozen of them, and it looks at different ways of approaching the issue of engagement. But it also includes a number of audio, radio programs, if you like, in the form of podcasts, and you can listen to those and hear examples. And the people who have been interviewed for those podcasts are specialists and experts who've worked for many, many years in media engagement departments or teams or press offices in charities. And nearly all of them have also been journalists and are very experienced at that as well. So if you want to have a single point to find all that information, then that website is going to be your best one.
What is that?
I've got it on the board for you shortly. It's the SD, or Sustainable Development 2015.org website. If you do sd2015.org, that also works. The PDF, Engaging with the Media, by the way, comes in 4 different languages as well. And if that's useful to do, the one I'm holding here is in English, but you've also got it in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. So those are all online, and you'll find them at that website. Now, what I should also say is that I have a handout which gives you the information to get hold of everything as well, and you can pick that up before you leave. And we are also recording and web streaming this event. So if you miss anything today, or if you accidentally fall asleep for half an hour, don't do that, please. But if you did, you can find it online, and there'll be more information coming around about the link to find that, which will come via these guys at Civicus later on. Now today, I want to do 3 things. I want to revise what we covered in the first session in April briefly. I want to look at the importance of some of the things we talked about there. And what we talked about there were messages and audiences. Messages and audiences. Those are the things that we covered in the first session. We talked about the importance of thinking about what do you mean by a message. If you're ever approached by a journalist, then what is it that you're trying to say? I don't mean how can you make the most complex thing really detailed. I mean thinking about how you can make the engagement with that journalist simple enough and clear enough that the message will then get passed further. And we're going to talk about, later on today, we're going to talk about how to prepare in detail for those sorts of engagements with journalists. And we're going to talk also about how do interviews work. When you're talking with journalists, if it's a short interview, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes, how do you make that work? What is it about the interview that means that it is effective? Or what is it that means that it doesn't work at all and it's a waste of everybody's time? So we're going to come on to that. We're going to talk about that towards the end of today's session. We're going to talk about how to prepare for an interview as well. And we're going to talk about the things that you need to have really nailed down before you open your mouth to talk to a journalist. We're also going to talk at the end of the day about gauging success. So we're going to work out, okay, if we're talking about engaging with the media, how you do it, what you prepare, how the interview takes place, how can you then decide that that's been a success, or how do you work out whether you need to change your approach for the next time? So that will be the final part of today. Now we have to be out of this room at 6 o'clock, so we will be done by then. We will have a short comfort break in the middle of all this, because no one can sit around for 3 hours without stretching of the legs. So we will have a short break at about 20 past 4, just for a few minutes, so that I'll give you something to think about, maybe something to work on for a few minutes while you stretch your legs with people around you. And then we will continue through until just before 6 o'clock. And if you need to come and go, I understand it's a busy time. I don't take it personally. This is your workshop, not mine. So the first thing I want to do is to cast your mind back, those of you who were here in April, and just have a think about what we talked about. We talked about, amongst other things, what are messages and the relationship of messages with audiences. We have 4 elements, really, to work together whenever we're engaging with the media. One is, what are we actually trying to say? Another is, who are we trying to say it to? The third is, what's the medium that's being used? So this would be maybe print or radio or any kind of different medium these days, telephone. And the fourth one is the language or the tone that's being used. So these 4 elements, which are the message, the audience, the medium, and the language, these 4 elements always work together. So if you change one of them, it affects all the others. If you change the medium, and instead of it being a Facebook message, instead of that it was a television message, then the language changes, the audience changes. If you change the audience, then the medium changes, because different audiences will be using different media all the time. So all of these are different ways of thinking about your message and the context and the audience. All of these have to come together, because they do work together, all 4. They all affect each other. Now, those of you who are here, I'm wondering, when we talk about the message that you're trying to get across, does any of you remember one of the ways of remembering how to make it the most effective? We talked about thinking about what the audience is going to take away from the message. And we said that whenever you are thinking of talking to a journalist, you've got to think, okay, there's an audience for this message. What do I want them to, now, do you remember what we talked about, anybody? There were 3 things that we need to think about with the audience when we're trying to plan our messages. An effect of the message that we have on the audience. 3 different activities that might result from that effect in the audience. Anybody remember anything? You remember the exercise? That's a start. Okay, what do we want the audience to do? Or what do we want the audience to, not bad, understand? Yeah, understand. And crucially, what do we want the audience to, very good, remember. Excellent. So, when we're talking about planning, and we're thinking about how we are putting our messages together, we're also coming at this from the angle of, okay, what do we want the audience to do? What do we want the audience to understand? What do we want the audience to remember? Now, this can be a huge range of things. For some of the work that I do with different charities, their work is about raising awareness because they're running specific campaigns, maybe. So for them, they want the audience to remember that there's a campaign, maybe. It can be as simple as that. It might be they have a website that is going to support this, and for their audience, that's an important engagement tool. So it's what's the website's address. That would be another way of trying to focus the message, trying to make sure that the audience remembers that in some way. But this comes together into the key message concept. The key message concept is right at the heart of everything we're going to talk about today. The idea that you have some key messages which you need to get across to the audience, and the journalist is someone who's going to help you do that. I think those of you I met before, you know I'm a journalist by training. Therefore, you know that journalists are lovely people, yeah? Yeah, of course you do.
Well, we established at least they're human beings.
Yeah, good, okay. At least they're human beings. It's good to remember that, though, isn't it? Yeah, it's important to always remember that journalists are human beings. And so they operate like human beings. They're busy, they've got other things on their mind, they're working to deadlines, they've got editors who are breathing down their neck, they've got people shouting at them the whole time. Now, this is how journalists work. So then you're going to come along and you've got a message for them. So you've got to work with them. You've got to make sure that you understand that the journalist has other demands. You've got to make sure that the message is something that they get, that they understand it. They don't have much time, so you're going to have to distill things. I suspect a lot of you have met journalists, maybe even have been interviewed. How many people have been interviewed by journalists? But yeah, of course you have. A lot of you have. And makes you feel like you're trying to make things a bit oversimplified. They don't seem to want to know the detail. And this is really frustrating. And sometimes they put things in slightly different words, or they ask the wrong questions because they just don't understand. And you need them to understand. And you'd like to sit them down for a few days, maybe, yeah? Yeah. And you'd like to explain how it all works so they get it right next time. But that's not going to happen, is it? So we have to live in the real world where we're going to have to engage with this journalist. We talked today about engaging with the media. Actually, what we're talking about is engaging with another human being that is there working for the media and helping you get your message further so that it can reach a wider audience. So understanding who the journalist is becomes very important. What's their background, the context? Now this will affect your key messages. Key messages, when you're talking to a journalist, there don't need to be too many of them. Very often, particularly with broadcast interviews, which is my speciality, with broadcast interviews, you'll find that you'll have maybe 3 or 4 minutes in an interview, during which time you've got to get a lot of information across about what you're doing. But if you try and get too much information across, the whole edifice falls apart. It sounds like you're trying to lecture someone. It sounds like you're trying to put the entire learning of the world into just a few minutes, and the journalist will switch off. That means that the audience will switch off. So engaging with that human being and making sure that you're talking in a way which they can understand and will help them is something which is a collaboration between the two of you. The journalist is your friend. I think we said that last time. Too much mirth, I think. I remember that. It's true that the journalist is there because they do want to help to get the information across. But what you're going to do is you're going to engage with them to do it as a partnership. So don't see the journalist as an adversary. See the journalist as someone who can help you get the message across if the message is sufficiently sharp and simple that they feel their audience will be interested. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we talked about the importance of identifying the audience. And there are many ways of thinking of an audience, but journalists tend to know that they are focusing on a particular type of person. Each journalist has an idea in their head as to who their audience is when they're preparing a broadcast, writing a newspaper article, putting things in magazines. So for you, it's a question of recognizing the fact that that journalist does actually have some expertise in understanding their audience. So what might that mean for you if you are trying to prepare your own key messages? Give me some ideas as to how that might play out. What would be the things that you would use or things you need to think about when engaging with somebody when they're a journalist? Maybe you haven't met them or don't know them very well. What would you need to maybe ask them, think about, in order for that to happen in the most effective way?
I guess first of all, find out exactly what it is that they cover, and if your project meshes into what it is that they do already, or they understand.
Yeah.
If you can't go about women's rights to somebody who writes about agriculture, that's the one.
Good, and I've seen people trying that. I mean, there's no point in sending a press release to a sports journalist if you're working in sustainable development. But I've seen that sort of thing happen.
So you have to study their background and what articles they've written.
Excellent. So you're going to need to, you're going to need to stalk them a little bit. You're going to need to Google them, maybe look them up, and read their material. Look at their material. It seems to me that it's purely common courtesy that you at least spend 5 minutes trying to find out what a journalist is interested in, if they approach you, or if you want to approach them. I think that just would not, these days it doesn't take you long to do that, but it will get a flavor, not only for the subjects of what they write, but also the tone, the language, the kinds of people they like to talk to. So you need to do your homework a little bit when engaging with the media.
I can tell a story that probably doesn't belong here, but I was
We'd love to
the
hear
Daily News. Okay, everyone knows the Daily News. It was in New York City, and they were. I was the head of a union on my campus, and the president had wanted to be like chancellor, or he wanted a fancy position, and the journalists had found out that he had lied on that he said he had degrees he didn't have and all of this. So the Daily News is going after me. Okay, won't leave me alone. So how do you talk to the Daily News? Well, they always want a really good sound thing so they can put it in a headline.
Yes.
So they're going after me, and they're saying he's autocratic. They were trying to put words in my mouth, and I had enough sense to say, yes, he's autocratic, but he's an autocratic mensch. Now, the Daily News loved that, autocratic and mensch. And I had won, and I could talk to the president without, and yet the Daily News, and yet I had got what I wanted. He's really autocratic. But I had to kill myself because he's also, he is mensch. Anyway, But I don't know if that really illustrates, but yeah,
I think
I
it
have
does.
to really think about
Yes.
what they want.
And this is it. That they see the world, journalists see the world through a certain prism, just as you see it through a certain prism. But their prism will be slightly differently shaped. So for you, it's good to have a glance through their prism. That will help you to find the words that will make them feel that you actually do understand what they're doing. Because they don't take it personally if you don't give them a story, they just ignore you. Actually, if you can't actually feed or talk to them in a way where they can engage with you, they'll simply go to talk to somebody else. But they're not going to sit at home and cry about it. They're just going to take the line of least resistance. If you give them a good quote in a way that they would normally engage with their audience, they're going to love that, and it's worth doing. Now, something else that's interesting about that story, if you don't mind me saying so, is that in answer to one of the questions that you were getting, you said yes. Because too often, when people are approached by journalists, their first reaction is to say, please go away, because you're a journalist and you frighten the heck out of me. So we don't want that. It's not a question of saying no so much as say yes and, or yes, but. It's trying to engage with them in a way which isn't wholly negative. The other thing you have to remember about journalists, we did talk about this briefly in April, is they all think they're the best investigative journalists in the world, that they have this vision of their being in a place where they can change the world through their wonderful journalism. Actually, in reality, journalism is more like a sausage factory where you get information coming in and they just have to turn it around and out it goes again. So they never get to play that role until somebody tries to hide something. If you look as if you're trying to hide something, then journalists just get that smell of, aha, there's something going on here. So actually engaging with journalists, engaging with the media, is as much about being open, polite, honest, engaging, so that it doesn't actually come across that you're trying to hide anything, quite the opposite. And it means that you'll have a much more productive relationship with these people. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that, the importance of having that relationship with journalists. Does anybody here feel they actually do, through their work, have a pretty good rapport or relationship with a journalist? We got a few, that's good. Talk to me, Vicky, if you don't mind, to explain how that's come about.
Part of it is subject matter expertise, teaching environmental law and international environmental law, especially in this environment, and being both an academic and a mediator, being involved in large cases. The skill set that I learned as a mediator made me be able to listen attentively, rephrase, reframe questions if I don't really want to answer the questions that's being asked, but still getting to the heart of what the person's looking for. And I've done some really terrific people.
That's good to hear. And it's not just technical expertise, I would argue. I think it has to be more. That's important, definitely. But there probably has to be something more than that. Maybe a bit of patience with some journalists. Yeah. And giving them a bit of time to come around and think about.
Well, my daughter's a science writer and an editor, so I think I'm a little bit more patient because I can relate on that level as well.
Yes. Yeah. And everybody is someone's son and daughter. Every journalist, even journalists. Yeah. Someone else put their hand up. You said you had a rapport yourself, I think, with journalists. You put your hand?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you were.
Yeah, I did.
You weren't just waving at me.
No, I wasn't.
So talk to me about your story. You have a good rapport with certain journalists? Or?
Yeah, I originally wanted to become a journalist, so I know a lot of them from college, and I also have worked with them throughout the years. And I suppose I give them information that they need and quotes when they need it, and in turn they cover things that I would like to raise publicity for. And I also worked in communications for a number of organizations, so as a result we have certain contacts that we kind of developed over the years.
That's very good. I'm interested you say you developed them over years as well, so you maintain those relationships.
Yeah, because journalists tend to move around a lot, so they will move for different organizations, but they tend to have certain interests and they tend to write articles on certain topics. So it's even if they're working for different organizations, they do tend to when they know that they have a topic that's relevant to us, they tend to approach me.
Yes. That's an excellent example. And yes, hello.
I had an interesting experience with Roland Chassie International, and I asked him to delve a little further into his lecture because the Industrial Revolution had great effects on the First World War and the Second World War because they did not, I studied real estate, they did not take it into effect that when you change and you jump ahead, you actually have to nip in the bud certain things. You have to curtail certain things and do the economic things. Take your adjustment. And he looked at me and I said, my grandfather attended a conference in London in 1904, and I happened to want to know why he attended it, and I read things, and I got the documents about my grandfather that the government wanted to give me, actually stamped and sealed as a result of.
There you go. So a bit of human interaction does not do any harm, does it?
And he said thank you.
Yeah, well, that's good. If you get a journalist saying thank you, that's a good sign. That's excellent. We talked about journalists understanding their audiences. So they've got expertise which you can tap into. It was, I think, important to remember this, that the journalists have an expertise. They're not just there to be a conduit. I sometimes hear people use the phrase, using a journalist, that they, and how can I use this journalist to get my story out there? That's not the right approach. If a journalist feels they're being used, they're going to find every way to ignore you. Whereas if they feel they're being engaged with, and it's on the level they understand and you're using the right tone and language, then actually you're pushing at an open door because you're showing mutual respect. And it's the mutual respect that you're always trying to discover, that area of ground where both of you can see that you bring something extra to bear in this relationship. So you've got to work at that, and I think that's worthwhile working at. It's not, you're not playing a short game here. You're actually playing rather a long game, where you're developing relationships. And important also to do this when times are good. So what you're doing is you're trying to help people get to know you and what you do when things are not so pressured. I would be very worried if you only engage with journalists in the first week of September this year, given that the middle of September is an important period of time this year, and then December later on. You know, if you started to do that engagement just a couple of days before the General Assembly, or just before the Paris conference, you get nowhere. You've got to actually start a little earlier than that, which is why it's so great that Civicus have been organizing these things through the year, and we've got all these online resources. So journalists are part of the story. They understand the audience. We talked earlier on about different types of audiences. You can split audiences in many different ways. They have their interests. They may be older or younger. They might have specialist interests. They might be people who have certain hobbies or perhaps work in certain industries. And that's different ways of segmenting an audience. So when you're thinking about your messages, you're always thinking about what sort of audiences am I talking about here, and don't try to talk to everybody at once. If you try to focus a message on the entire world all at once, it'll end up not getting through to anybody. So it needs to be a bit more focused than that. This is exciting. What's all this about? This is very exciting. Really, it's a man. Just going to pause while he does that. So when we talk about audiences, we're also talking about understanding from a journalist how they think of their audience. There's a story I may have mentioned, I may not, but I'll mention it again anyway. When I was first working in a local radio station in the north of England, when I was much younger than I am today, our boss said, this is a new radio station, and we'd like you to have a very focused feeling to how you're broadcasting to the area of Northern England. And so we'd like you to imagine that the person you are talking to when you're on the air is a woman of 32 years old who has 2 young children around her feet, and she's doing the ironing while you are talking to her. And we were thinking, who is this 32-year-old woman that this boss of ours knows? We thought he was a married man, and his wife isn't 32. So what's all this? And then we realized he'd made it up. That he was saying, imagine there is a person like this 32-year-old woman, And this is the image to have in your head. And what he was saying to us was, if you imagine that's who's listening, it will affect the way you talk. You will be talking in a way which that individual will understand, it will engage with that individual, and that individual is a representation of our target audience. And he built up this picture of a person who was imaginary, but she was this 32-year-old, she had an ironing board in front of her because there was a wireless in the corner, you know, so the radio was on, we were broadcasting through that radio, and he even described the shape of the house, how big the house was, which village it was in, so we went into a huge amount of detail. Now, for you, when you're thinking about your messages and how you're going to engage with a wider audience, then the individual point, it's important for you to think, what kind of person am I trying to reach here, and therefore, which language would I use? What are the messages that will resonate with them? Your example of the autographic mention is a really good one. So, journalists are part of the picture, but they're not the full picture. Journalists are what we would call perhaps a primary audience. Primary and secondary target audiences are something which you'll have to get used to. The idea that you've got a secondary audience that needs to understand the message, but you're going to have to go through the primary target, which will be your journalists. That will be a way that many of you will operate, because you will actually not have direct access to an audience through the media. You'll be going through an intermediary, which will be the journalist. And this plays out in a number of ways as well. But one of the things that's important these days, we're not going to talk so much today about social media, but one of the important things about social media is that you're giving things that are shareable as well. Sharing is a very important aspect of social media. And so whatever you're talking about, how you're engaging with people, what information you're giving out, the examples you talk about, ideally should be shareable in some form if you're using social media. Now, we talk about messages. I think we talk quite hypothetically and generally about messages, but we need to also, I think, pin down a little bit about what it means to be thinking up messages for the kinds of things that you are going to be talking about with journalists. Key messages, the kinds of things that we are going to engage with the audiences at any given moment, can range from quite broad to very specific. But the ones that really resonate are the ones that are easy to understand, simple to remember, and are the ones which really seem to engage with real life for the people who are in the audience. So I'm wondering if we can just take those three approaches, making things engageable with real life, memorable, simple, and get you to have a think just for a few minutes about what key messages might look like in the kinds of areas where you work. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to have a chat with the person sitting next to you, or if you come with a friend who works in the same area as you, have a think about 3 simple messages which would be relevant to a more general audience who is going to learn and be interested in what you're doing in the context of 2015. So 3 simple messages. They have to be simple enough that I could remember them just by you telling me them, and I don't have to write them down. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to think of those 3 messages. Any questions about what I've asked you to do? Okay, see what you can come up with, and then we'll compare notes in about 5 minutes.
I tried this one.
Look into this real right now.
Yeah.
You can also do is open up a countdown. Say we'll be back in 15 minutes. And
what about
Let's do the camera. Oh yeah, that's good. Roll. Roll. Is it?
Okay, one more minute on this, folks. One more minute. Yes, I'm
Oh, I got it.
Okay, let's have a listen to some of the thoughts I've had. I'm not going to ask every one of you, otherwise we'll be here till midnight, but I'm interested in some of the things we can do. So, we got the board up and running. I'm just going to put up some basic thoughts about key messages here. I'm going to hear your messages in a moment. The reason I ask you to think about 3 is that 3 is not a bad number of key messages to think of. Because most of the time when you engage with journalists, they're not going to have much time. Their articles or their broadcast is going to be sufficiently short that you would want it to be just focusing on some really simple things. And 3 is a maximum in my mind for a typical interview that you would do. You may have to repeat the message a few times in the interview. That's certainly true, but that's a good sort of number to think of. Right, let's hear some. Does anybody want to give me a go at some of their key messages? I suggested you think of 3. Are we going to get any volunteers, or should I just pick on some? Any volunteers? Anybody in the back? Come on over here. You look like you're having a good conversation. Give me an example of a message that you want to get across to your wider audience.
Are you familiar with the MDGs?
Okay, so
we're thinking about MDGs, what they achieved and what the major achievements were: a reduction of poverty.
Okay, a reduction of poverty. Yeah, I'm with you.
And, so we didn't write it down, but we were trying to say, just very short, the MDGs achieved historic results in the reduction of poverty.
Okay, so your message was, there's something that works, it's worked, we know it works, so maybe we can do better? There's that sort of subtext I'm picking up from that? Because I'm thinking a general audience doesn't just want to know what's happened in the past. So that's a good thing to use as an example, if you can then pin it down. But
you could extend it by saying we achieved a lot, but there remain challenges.
Okay, good. We've got some more over there.
Well, we actually had a very hard time deciding who our audience is. We did agree, we did agree that we wanted to talk about in 2015. That's what we've been thinking about. But then we kept going back and forth between university, rural women, and then we ran out of time.
No, but we have one key message. So we focused on post-2015. So post-2015, the emphasis of the commitments is on the well-being of people.
Okay.
But we've been discussing how to
How to get
How do you narrow that down?
how to get
Yeah, okay.
to the-
Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to that in a moment. Yeah.
I didn't know. I was maybe too flippant. I just suggested one that comes out of working group and girls take over the UN, which they plan to do in October on the International Day of the Girl. And then this was being flippant. I mean, UN tries again with SDGs. I mean, those would catch attention. But what about opinion versus news?
Let's come to that in a moment.
Okay, but that I don't know what to do with the message. I don't know if it's an opinion.
Yeah, understood. So one of the issues that come out of the all of the discussion over here was trying saying it's all about alleviating poverty the world over it's huge. And it doesn't relate to an individual's personal life. So wherever you're going to be talking about all of this, you've got to try and introduce an aspect as quickly as possible into the conversation that you're having with journalists, which means that it can be narrowed down sufficiently to mean something. Now, the difficulty you had here was, because you weren't quite sure which the audience might be, you can't narrow it down. You've got to know who the audience is, because otherwise you can't work out what examples are going to resonate with them. So you may start with quite a big concept. You've actually got to narrow it down pretty quickly for it to be a message which fits into our idea of key messages. And this involves quite a lot of thinking and planning.
So we did narrow it down
Okay.
initially, so that we wanted to be at the grassroots level,
doing public awareness on the new post-2015, whatever it's going to be, the SDGs. Because there's going to be NGOs on the ground to do that. But then we thought that was too broad, that we needed to come even finer and finer. And that's when we started to urban people, to universities, you know.
Sure.
So can the same message be just tweaked? Sorry, that's my question.
My view is that you can tweak the key messages, but you've got to introduce something specific quite quickly into the way that message is described.
But the SDG, so let me really ask my question. So the question is, and this is the reality, that once September comes and then 2016 and the indicators are out there, it is going to fall on NGOs to help the UN get people to buy into this.
Yes.
This whole new, whatever the post-2015 agenda will fall out to do. Because we're going to be asking people to be, you know, more sustainable in their life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, in one hand, the whole message really is for every level of person. But how do you track them then with the same message?
Okay. You have to sound as if you're talking to the person who's listening. You have to sound, and that means you've got to be more specific in the way you engage with the individual journalists you're engaging with. I think that you can have broad messages, but you've got to give examples. And sometimes what happens is people will try to pack too many examples into the way they're talking to journalists. And so they'll give a list of different things. I think this is one of the issues that you'll have around the SDGs, given that there are 17 different areas. And that makes it very difficult for journalists, because if there are 17, you can't write an article about that without it being a list. And you can't broadcast it in 3 minutes. So you have to say, okay, we're aiming to do these broad things, but here is an example of how it can make an enormous difference. The example I'm going to give you is an example you then got to work into that interview or conversation with a journalist is going to be an example which fits the relevance of the audience that journalist works with. And that's where your homework comes in. That's where trying to make it as relevant as it possibly can be by showing examples, working into how it's going to affect people in real life. I mean, if I were to say to you, SDGs, great idea, how would it affect you tomorrow, or the day after, 1st of October? What would you do differently in your life? That's the kind of thing.
Exactly. The UN is going to come out with some branding, like the way they did with the MDGs.
Sure.
We're all familiar with what those 8 symbols are. They're going to do some.
Well, you are, but we're not speaking about the world.
No, I know that. I'm saying those are the symbols.
Sure.
And they're going to do something similar to them.
Sure.
So that's going to be the broad thing, and you're saying, focus in on like goal 5.
In my head, I think a lot of this stuff, which is quite high level, is a bit like a tent that's flapping in the wind and about to blow away. That's an analogy I have in my head. I think that people like you are the intermediaries to the extent that you can construct the tent pegs, possibly provide a mallet, and if you're really good, you can absolutely smash those pegs bit by bit into the ground so that the whole thing doesn't flow away in the wind, but it starts to feel grounded. It actually starts to feel that it means something to real people. Now, I think the way you do that is you talk in a language where it means something to people today. When they hear you talk, they can relate it to their real lives. And of course, everybody's real life is different in different places and different times, depending on who they are. And this is where you've got to think about audience, because you can't address every audience in the same way all the time.
Suppose you think that the audience is going to be afraid of the subject. Like, for instance, with climate change, a lot is going to have to change out of the war, and people are afraid to think of that. I mean, they can't, so how do you, how can you look into that?
Well, people tend to fear the worst unless you can then pin it down a bit. So if you can give people something which is small and won't make them frightened, you tell me, you're the expert.
Okay.
Yeah.
An example would be something like 4.3, okay, on the SDGs at the moment. It talks about education for everyone so that they can get a job, technical education. So you say, how that would improve your life is it means that if you're changing jobs, you will have the right to make sure you get the training and skills to be able to get a new job. And that might will change your life as a young person, but also as an adult, because it will mean that no longer will you have no education or no training ability. I mean, that's a very small little thing, but what I would try and do is pick up some of those small little ones that really relate to in a very personable kind of way, or you would say and particularly when I'm speaking to people in the global north, I'm trying to say the difference between these ones are is that they're not just for poor people, or sometimes I even say something as controversial as something like they're not just for black people in Africa, like you thought that they were previously. You're trying to also promote because that's the stigma against it. This time it will affect everyone. It will affect people of all colours, of all countries, and of all ages everywhere in the world. And the example is it's going to affect your education opportunities, and then you give that example.
And of course, the example you give will change depending on who your audience is.
Exactly,
right. So that is a good example. Thank you for that. No, it's perfect. I always think that with big subjects, what you've got to do is it's like eating an elephant. You tackle it bit by bit. One bite at a time. One bite at a time. I'm so sorry. That was an appalling analogy. It's like eating an oak tree. Is that okay? No, forget it. It's an appalling analogy. But it's the idea of getting very big things bit by bit. The idea that you can actually tackle a big subject, which can be frightening, by saying, actually, this needn't be frightening, because here's an example, and then that's the trick, finding those examples. And so it works in this way, in this example, and so it doesn't have to be as bad as you thought it was. What you're actually doing is, to a large extent, is you're giving real concrete examples so that you are knocking down people's individual prejudices about how things might be worse than that. That's one of the dynamics that's going on, I think, with this. So I like the question, though. That's very good. You had a question about, before we come to your question actually about opinion as well, let's just talk a little bit about other examples of key messages, because we're working hard over here as well. Let me come again. Yes. Give me one example of your key message. Global action for a better life. Now, that's a slogan, and slogans are useful, but it isn't a key message in an interview. A key message would be, in an interview, would be, here's an example, or how can we make that work to the audience that we're talking to. So you can start with the overall. You're very good at the high level stuff. I get this feeling that you're really good at this, that you understand where you're going. The difficulty is then pulling that down into real practical examples, and that takes a lot of work. And this is why I'm suggesting you work with journalists as your partner. Because journalists have to do this all the time, is what they do. And if you say to them, this is what we're trying to do, and how does that work? Can you give me examples of the ways of expressing this in my work? If you have a good rapport with a journalist, that can help you get down to that. So when it's like a partnership. You get to know the journalist, and the journalist gets to know you, and you try to make sure that you both understand what you're trying to achieve. That's what it is. Now, you gave a good example of a slogan, as I say, and we talk about that in the online areas that we've got for you as part of this project. If you go to the website, there's a whole section there about messages, and we talk about how messages and slogans are different. We talked about that actually in April as well, in this room, where we gave you an example of a few slogans, and we said these are good slogans, and now we need to pull them down into individual key messages whenever we're talking on the media or with journalists. Very good, thank you. You had an example. You wrote it down.
Governments of 193 states and the General Assembly are agreeing to provide access to clean drinking water globally. Involved in this process are as many as 1,500 NGOs, stakeholders, and others who are urging the adoption and implementation of sustainable development goals. I think that should be edited out.
Okay, hold on a minute.
And this is resulting in significant drops of waterborne diseases and even deaths. For example, Susie Q, a 21-year-old mother of two in the Central African Republic, who contracted the disease, preventing proper digestion.
Okay, that's an article. That's a whole article.
I do think it's working. We had a nice agreement at the beginning, and then we just kept adding.
That's okay. I mean, that's what happens. But if you were being interviewed, what's the one thing you'd want the audience to remember from that? Would be the question I would throw at you.
Because the General Assembly is committed to making sure that the world has clean drinking water.
That might be quite appropriate as a key message. Yes, that might be appropriate in different contexts. It might be one of the other messages in there. But yes, and the thing is, if you keep it really simple, it means that you can bang away at that message with the journalists and in the different media outlets that you engage with, so that everybody gets it. What can happen is that people can start to glaze over after a while if you pile in too much. And actually, I noticed that happening as you got to your third paragraph.
Well, I was too.
Yeah, there you go.
So I just kept adding more. As long as you were working with other people, she could
If it's
kept
not
adding.
engaging you and you're reading it out, it's not going to engage anyone else. It's a good example of it. And I think the top line was a good one.
Building on that, clean drinking water can improve health.
Yes, good. That sort of thing that's a good key message. Now, the key messages that you come up with might come out of your mouth in different ways when you're being interviewed. So when you're being interviewed and talking to a journalist, your key message is there in the background, and it is the thing you're going to make sure you don't forget to mention. It's going to be simple. There's only going to be 3, but it's going to be simple. If it's not simple, you won't find it easy to express it with journalists, and you won't be able to get the message across to them. But it will come out of your mouth in slightly different ways. So when we talk about messages, we're not talking about learning a script. We're not necessarily even talking about learning a slogan. A slogan could be there in the background for you again, but you will engage as a human being with the journalist, talking in a different way each time you open your mouth, because that's what we do in real life. And try not to make it sound like you've rehearsed a script. Try to make it sound like it's something where you're engaging with that other human being to convince them of the importance of what you're doing. And that means it will come out of your mouth in slightly different ways at different times. But it will be constantly repeating the same key messages for that sort of campaign or that period of time. The other element of this is you're taking control. I mean, I've just put on the board there a couple of different sort of ideas for key messages. Keep them simple, keep them a few of them, but the idea is you're taking control here. When you're engaging with a journalist, do you feel they're in control, or do you feel you're in control? That's the question, I think. How many people, when they're engaging with a journalist, think the journalist is holding all the cards? It does depend on the situation. But generally speaking, for the kinds of things you're talking about, you are the one who is the expert. I wasn't joking when I said you're the expert, you tell me, because you are specialists in the area in which you work, and I'm not. I don't work in that area. I'm a journalist working in that area, but I don't do the work you do. So what that means is, if you're talking to the journalist, the reason they're going to listen to you is because you've got something they don't have, which is some expertise in that area. You have authority because of your training, or you have a position, which means that you have some influence, but you have expertise. That means that you are the one who holds the cards, and many people forget this. Many people actually forget that when you're talking to a journalist, you're the one who has all the knowledge, and it's up to you to try and make them understand what that knowledge really means in real terms. What are the examples that you can bring to bear that help them to get that? So with a key message, it's all part of you. Don't forget your messages, because that will reinforce the importance of what your expertise is, and then you can take control of the interviews. Now, we will talk more about that a little bit later on. I want to talk about taking control and what that means for you when you're engaging with a journalist. We're going to talk about that in more practical ways a little bit later on this afternoon. Journalists are, as we said earlier on, just to reiterate, busy people. They're focused on particular audiences. They're looking for news all the time, and they are human beings. I'm glad you remember that. And journalists work in busy newsrooms like this. This happens to be a newsroom in a place I used to work. Most newsrooms these days seem to look the same. They've got cameras, they've got computers, whether it's radio, online, print, television, they all seem to look the same. A quick word on press releases for you. This is a financial journalist who put this up on Twitter recently, and I thought I'd share it with you. He says, a note to public relations people, that's PRs. I almost never run stories using a press release, and if you call me about a press release, I never do. Probably some of you are used to the idea of press releases being the golden gateway to a journalist's time or to get on the air. And actually the opposite tends to be true, because journalists actually find press releases to be the most boring way of engaging with them. Now obviously there may be some times when a press release can support something you're doing, and that's important to just reflect on that. But generally speaking, press releases tend to be, on their own, tend to be something which do not really engage well with people who are busy. And most press releases will actually just find their way onto into a rubbish bin in a journalist's office. So I thought that was a good example, just for those of you who are wondering whether one of the ways of engaging with a journalist is to go down the press release route. Have any of you actually found press releases to be useful, or perhaps the opposite? I don't know. Any experience personally in press releases? Yes.
I find with very localized media, I mean, this is particularly in Britain, but also in Western European countries where local media now is completely stripped out of any journalistic support. You've got one person writing a whole newspaper.
Very true.
Actually, press releases do often help if they're written in a way that can be taken almost effectively as an article. They'll write their name on it and they'll just put it they wrote it. And that means it's got to be a press release that's not just selling your product, it's got to be written in a kind of quite balanced kind of way. And they do take it. On the national level, I find they tend not to take it because, of course, there's more journalistic integrity in that sense. Sometimes you do want to reach out at the local level, and sometimes if you're so busy, if you write something for them, they'll shove it in.
Sure, so I appreciate that. That's a good way of putting it. I mean, I think that where you're doing that, you're almost just writing the paper rather than doing a press release. And that, of course, is reality, and that works in that context. One of you actually, last time I was here, talked about how you thought about the style the magazine used, and you wrote an article in that magazine in that style, and it was actually in the form of a press release, I think. Is that? No, it wasn't you. There was someone in the room who said that. I thought that was a good example of where they thought about the audience.
It's actually quite successful. Like what we do is, again, either submit an article as a press release, like Lloyd said, or try and write an article and say, we understand you're really busy. We'd like to publish it, you're not going to charge it.
Yes, there are many ways to do this. Can I just play you an example? Again, this is something that as a way of revising what we did in April, I just wanted to play you one thing which I think is important for all of you to hear. This guy is the media head at the Disasters Emergencies Committee, based in London. And so they coordinate a lot of relief after earthquakes and other disasters. And they coordinate work of about 14 different big international NGOs. Now, he's a guy who's worked in lots of different charities and NGOs over his career. But I always like listening to what he's got to say. And one of the things he told me for podcasts, which are the online podcasts that you can find at sd2015.org, was about your approach to journalists. I'm going to play that to you just for a minute.
So you know what you want. You want obviously relevant coverage of your organisation and the work that you do. You might want help with some of your advocacy. You might want help with some of your fundraising. But you want to raise your profile in one way or the other. And I think the critical thing to do is to turn that on its head. Stop thinking about what you want for a moment and start thinking about what the media wants. So look at the media you're interested in. You'll see that there's probably variation amongst the media, whether it's local media or international media. You'll see they cover different types of stories in different ways. Try and identify the individuals within the media organisations that you want coverage in, that are interested in the kinds of things that you do, and read their stories or watch their stories, so you understand the sorts of things they write and what they're interested in, all the products they create if they're doing things online or radio or television. You've then got a much better chance of coming to them with a way of telling your story that fits with what they do.
So his point was start thinking about what the media wants. Start thinking about what the media wants. Don't start thinking about what you want. You know what you want. Start thinking about what journalists, the media want. And then work together so you're both satisfied about what's happening in the relationship between both of you to reach an audience. Another bit of revision for you. What is news? Do you remember we talked about this? What is news? I don't know if you remember what we decided news was. Do you remember some of the ideas? Actually, what is news? If we were to just pick 3 adjectives or 3 words to describe what it might be. Anyone remember?
Something you didn't know before.
Okay, like it. Something new you didn't know. Like it very much. Yeah, excellent. So this is an important part of key messages as well. If the audience already knows it, then what are you doing telling it now? You know, it has to be more than that. I like that very much. Anything else?
They should be provocative. They should provoke thoughts.
Engaging in that respect, certainly. I like that. Yeah. Relevant, very good. Relevant. This is where examples are so important. If it's not relevant, it's not really news. If it's not relevant directly, then maybe it has to be sufficiently interesting or provocative. So a big story from the other side of the world, which involves one human being, would only really be news if it was sufficiently big that you can engage as a human being with that story. So there has to be some human interest there. But generally speaking, news has to be new, something that people don't know. I like that very much. Interesting and certainly relevant. Now, we must bear this in mind when we're also thinking about different types of media. I'm going to just put up on the board here 4 different areas of media that we can segment, if you like, and give a little bit of an idea of sort of sorts of different factors that work really well. In print, human stories always work, by the way. You'll see there's a theme here. But in print, human interest works. Facts and statistics can work quite well in print. Statistics don't work very well in broadcast media, but they work well in print because people can reread them and you can show graphs and things. Quotes are very good. You know, an individual quoting, saying something about the work you're involved in and doing it by name, so that in the quote it shows, you know, the boss of this NGO says this, and this is what they believe, and then there's a quote. That works well. Also, of course, pictures. Radio works very well with examples, much more informality. Topicality is very important for radio. It has to be something that you're talking about which is really relevant today, not just relevant for the last couple of weeks or something. And obviously sounds. And TV, again, human interest, moving pictures, an open approach. Television can sometimes come across as hiding something if you don't come across as open. And we'll talk more about that after we've had a break in a moment. And please, 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 lots of examples in the way you talk about things so that you can actually pin down the points that are trying to be made in real people's experiences. Social media is really all about interactivity and sharing, as I'm sure you know. But again, human stories get shared more than others. Clearly, informality is a big thing with social media. And again, topicality, things that are happening right now, not something that happened a couple of weeks ago. I get very annoyed now that Facebook starts to put things up at the top of my newsfeed, which were from a few months ago. It's sort of like a new reminder thing. It says, remember this lovely thing happened a few months ago, and I'm thinking, that was a few months ago, I'm not interested. So whether that, whether they keep on doing that, I don't know. But social media works in that way. The sharing element is the one you never forget with social media. And with all of this, human interest goes with all of them. It is about people. It's not about processes. So for you today, one of the most important things to take away from this is the fact that we're talking always about the effect on real people, which is why when I was trying to get you to think a little bit about your key messages, it wasn't about perhaps thinking of a slogan so much as how's it going to affect a real person today, now? Because that will help you focus on the human side of things, and that always gets more interest, the human element. The fact that there is a process this year, of course, is important to you because you're fitting into the process as the SDGs are being hammered out. I understand how important that is to you. That's of no interest at all to most of your audiences. I'm afraid that's just true. And so focusing on how it affects real people, and I'm using a term there, a bit of jargon really. I say real people. I know we're all real people in some respect, but when I say real people, I mean not people like me, a journalist, not people like you who are working in your work. I mean the people who are affected by the work you do. Those are real people. So that's what we're looking for. Newspapers talk about names, faces, and places. In the old days, papers talk about this. Names, faces, and places. You get names in the newspaper, you get faces in the newspaper, you talk about places in the newspaper that are relevant to the audience, and then people buy the paper. So that's not a bad approach to take. We showed you an example last time about Rwanda, where a way of talking about business development in Rwanda was actually to talk about these women making ice cream. And it makes it an interesting story about ice cream businesses, but then it lodges it into the Rwanda experience.
And everybody loves ice cream.
That's exactly right. That's what makes it so relevant. You know, anybody who's not interested in business but is interested in ice cream might read that article. The people thing plays out in ridiculous ways. I showed you this earlier actually as well. This is a charity working in Oxfordshire, and they got in the paper just because they had a great picture of people painting the ceiling. At one level, that's ludicrous. You know, at one level, it's ridiculous. Why are we in the paper? Well, it's a new community centre, or you know, there's reasons that you could actually convince the newspaper that it'd be worthwhile printing that into paper. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about preparing for interviews. And what I'd like to do is give you a 10-minute comfort break, and we're going to move ourselves on to an area which I want to spend the rest of the day talking about. The area I want to talk about is how you can actually prepare and carry out interviews when talking to journalists, and in particular when they're recording that interview. So this works particularly for television and radio, but obviously also these days a lot of journalists will record things for use on the web, even if it's not primarily for a television station. So these days, we're in a multimedia journalistic experience just about for every interview you ever do. And I think it's important to remember that. So I'm going to ask you a question. If you were preparing for interviews, then just have a think about all the different types of interview that there might be that you could conceivably be part of. You know, television and radio, that's two different types, obviously, but different ways that an interview could be carried out. Different scenarios where you might be involved in an interview. See if you can come up with maybe 4 or 5 different examples of different types of interview that might be typically used, different scenarios, which people find themselves in. Just brief examples, nothing very detailed. And I'll just sort of pick up some of the things that you've thought about. You can do this in your groups, as you did before, and combine that over the next 10 minutes with a quick stretch. And that will make it feel better. So, any questions about what I've asked you to do? Different types of interviews. Simple as that. It's not a trick question. What are the different types of interviews? Good. Any other questions before we break? Good. Got 10 minutes. So come back at 20 to 5. That was very interesting. Such a good point. It's nice.
Yeah.
right, thank you.
I understand your frustration. I understand why you want to stop. He doesn't care. It's Taylor Mooney's cat. No, it's fine. I didn't look about. So long as this is when you're in. I've now done the spreadsheet. They haven't been done for years. And when I talk to Ashish about it, it's very offensive. And I'm like, it's not an issue you need to be defensive about. It's just.
Where? I see.
He said he'd give you the first. He likes to travel.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, they're here. Yeah.
So we'll see.
Is that going to be, let's see,
It's fine. It's fine.
just, it's fun to do it, yeah.
I was struggling.
The good old days. Now, you know my favorite negotiations? Previous, yeah, when we had the incident, my favorite was actually
Like you're a small guy.
that was the day. That's 69. Yes, because that's not where you pay. But I came back in. So it's better than
Yeah, it's temporarily.
As soon as you have, you have a chair and a desk and a house, takes perspective. Okay, that's chair. So there's bits around that. So I think if you move some of it, just have a puzzle, then you're wanting to relate to push my students to I see. So people do, very cool.
Yeah.
I once met a whole load of listeners. They wouldn't look you up.
That happens. They are the UNHQ.
That's my problem.
I've been to mediation training. Maybe it's like HR better. But I think, yeah. Because that was the problem. I was supposed to go out Oh, what a shame. No possibility to get to type shoe. You still actually, oh, yeah.
These are clients, these are something that are sharing. It's great to meet you. You're lucky. I worked for other organizations while I and then I was in Genesis Communications. I was representing for a year. Now I'm in the room, which is much lower. Yeah, no worries. So I've also been so you were finished. Shall we have
Okay, everybody, let's reconvene. Let's talk about interviews and hear about some of the different types that you might have discussed. I want to focus for the last part of today, so it's going to be the next hour or so, to focus on interviews and preparing for them. As I said earlier on, just about every interview you do with a journalist is a multimedia experience now because they all carry recorders of some sort. So we need to talk about what you want to prepare. And I started by asking you a slightly strange question, just as it kicks off. How many different types of interviews are there? Just share out some examples of different types of interviews you can think of.
Skype.
A Skype interview, okay. A radio interview, okay. Telephone interview. I didn't hear what you said.
Telephone.
Yeah, telephone. A street interview, very good. Okay, so when we talk about radio, obviously that's a very broad sort of subject. And radio is where I was first trained as a journalist. But with radio, we could not narrow that down. We could say, okay, street interview for radio. We could say street interview for television as well. You could have an on-location interview because you're a specialist in a certain area. And so the interview is actually done in a place which reflects the work that you do. And I know I've got some quite interesting examples there where people have been interviewed outside somewhere where the background noise is about the thing they talk about. So I'll show you a photograph of that in a minute. Other kinds of interview. Did anybody talk? Yes.
Since you're British, I thought I would bring this up, but the Financial Times, you know, this Saturday, they went on a page, lunch with the Financial Times, and they take some important person usually, and they get invited to lunch, and they discuss, well, there is an interview, and they also discuss
the food as well. Yeah, that's a really great way of making a boring subject accessible. Because if the business person is really boring, you just start talking about food. But the other point about that is that that's a journalistic trick to try and make something more interesting and engaging because we all have to eat. You know, so let's see someone famous eating and talk about them and then their relationship to food. That's a really good example. So I'm also thinking about how many people are involved in interviews. You see, most of the time, it may well be that if you're approached by a journalist, you would be being interviewed on your own. But did any of you come up with the idea not just of a single interview, but actually of being interviewed amongst many? Did you talk about that? Because being part of a discussion type of interview, where you're being interviewed but so are other people, is quite common. And so there are many different types of interview. I didn't want you to run away with the idea that there's only one kind, but you may be involved or invited to talk to journalists in a number of different scenarios. And you might find that occasionally you're up with someone else being interviewed and it's a discussion around the topic. That happens, the people being interviewed often have different views because there's no point in having the same views coming out of two different people in a media interview, for example. So it's quite likely that you may have one kind of view and the other person may have others. And that brings us up nicely to the idea of opinion versus fact, which I think is what our colleague over here was talking about earlier on. And so when we're preparing for interviews, there are a number of questions that you need to ask. And we're going to talk about the questions that you would want to ask in a moment. I just thought I'd put up some examples of different types of interview scenario. This is a radio studio, it happens to be a BBC radio studio. And you've got a presenter who controls all the equipment, he's live on air, and on the other side there is someone being interviewed. And the one thing you notice about this is that there can sometimes be quite a lot of physical barrier between you and the person asking questions of you. In a studio that can be quite a distance, it's not very intimate in that respect, and you've got a big piece of equipment between you. But you can also be in a situation like this one, which is from East Timor, which is a radio studio, which is a bit more makeshift. And that's actually a very common scenario where you'll be being interviewed by somebody where the equipment is really simple and you're sitting there and they're just monitoring the level of it. So it doesn't have to be very high tech even. This is an example that came to my mind a moment ago, an expert in something to do with grasshoppers, I think it is, in Canada. And so they wanted to interview him with grasshoppers behind him and making a noise. So they're on location doing that, and that makes for a much more interesting and engaging interview. If you're working in a particular area of sustainable development, it could well be that it makes for a much more engaging interview if you take a journalist and show them something. That takes more time, but is very worthwhile doing if you can. This is a street interview which I found a picture of in China. What I love about this is that there's not just a camera and there's not just someone holding the microphone but there's a guy holding up a piece of paper. I have no idea what that is, but I think it's to reflect the light onto the face of the guy. He's the lighting man, I think.
It's a telephone.
Well, I wondered that when I first saw it, I thought maybe this is a script, but then I thought it's too small. I think it's for light. I think it's to try and make the guy's face line up a little bit. Now, the thing about this is that in all of these photographs, you've got some recording equipment, and actually the recording equipment in this one is quite intrusive. You've got a microphone, you've got a guy with a bit of paper, you've got three people in front of you, and you're supposed to answer questions, you know? In all of these examples, the trick you've got to pull is you've got to ignore the technology. So if you're being interviewed at all, ever, for radio or television, try to zone out any technology. Because what you're really doing is you're talking to the person who's the journalist. You're talking to the person asking the question. And it is not a performance. I'm going to repeat this later because I think it's important to always remember this. Many people, when they're being interviewed for the media, in particular if it's radio or television, going through their mind is, it feels like you're on a stage, that you're going to be broadcasting to lots of people. But that is not the frame of mind to be in. If you're going to engage with the journalist and they're going to interview you, please just talk to the journalist. Talk to the individual person who's asking the question. Don't think of it as a performance. Don't think of it that you're standing on a stage. It's an intimate conversation. And the reason that's so important is because it means you'll be trying to engage that human being, that journalist, in the way you talk to them when they ask you questions. And if you're engaging that one person, you'll be engaging all the audience who might be listening in. So they're eavesdropping. If you want to think of it in that way, the audience is eavesdropping.
It's very easy to say that, but if you're, for example, doing a live TV audience and there's an actual TV audience in front of you, all sitting there facing them, it's kind of hard to zone them out.
I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy. But I think in most situations, you're going to choose. I mean, today we have you in the room and I'm concentrating on you. I'm aware of the fact that there's a webcast being recorded. It's difficult for me to do both at the same time. I have to choose one or the other, really. Because it's not so much a performance. I mean, I know this is not an interview. But if I were being interviewed, I would want to make sure that I'm engaging the human being who's asking the questions. Now, if the audience is asking the questions, by all means, that can happen too. But generally speaking, in this scenario, like the guy on the picture there, he needs to talk to the woman asking the questions. He needs to ignore the cameraman, and he definitely needs to ignore the man with the white paper. This is from Uganda, and I think this is a really interesting example of how the technology has got smaller. You know, this is a guy doing an interview, and I think it's for a newspaper, but he's recording it, and that's not unusual. And in fact, even for radio, the ability to have very high quality recordings now with smartphones and very small digital recorders like that, it's so easy that there may not be much technology, but you're still being recorded, and that's always worth remembering. So we're not talking about media interviews being a big production number. We're talking about it being very intimate, even to the extent that the recording equipment might be tiny. Or that maybe that's a very big piece of recording equipment and they are giants. I don't know. No, I don't think so. I think that's really a very small piece of equipment. So what would you like to ask a journalist? That's the question I've got for you. Let's imagine you've been asked for an interview that someone has rung you up and they said they're interested in what you do. They know about the fact that there's all this going on at the United Nations. You're going to be perhaps chatting to them about what your work is. You've got a certain amount of time that's going to take. But I would suggest that there's some questions you'd like to ask them. I would suggest that it's not just a question of saying to them, yeah, I'll certainly come along and do an interview with you. Before you do that, I think you're going to need to ask some questions. I would like you, with your colleagues, to think of 5 different questions you could ask a journalist if they approached you. Okay, we talked about some of the things earlier this afternoon that will prompt you into asking the right questions, but I'd like you to come up, if you can, with 5 questions. And when you come up with 5 between you in your groups, just say bingo, or we've got 5, Or I don't care, just that I know you've got 5. Okay, you've got about 3 or 4 minutes. See if you can come up with 5 questions you're going to ask a journalist.
You got 5.
Wait, you got 5 over here. Okay, well done. You've got 5. Well done. Okay, the rest of you got 30 seconds.
I don't want to talk to you. I was gonna say.
Okay, let's hear some of the questions you've got. Well done. Right. Okay, I suggested that if the journalist approached you, you would want to ask them some questions. So let's hear some. Let's just work our way around. Give me a comment.
What's the purpose of this interview?
Why are you interviewing me? Okay, very good. Okay, excellent.
Who's your audience?
All right, now we're talking. Who's your audience? Who is this for? Love it. That's a fantastic question to ask. How much? You know what? I thought you said how much cash do I have? A whole different kind of relationship with a journalist. Good. How much time? Actually, okay, let's take a few more. We'll come back to that.
The format.
What's the format? Is it lots of people? Is it one person? Is it radio? Is it television? Lovely. Very good.
What the medium, like, is it a print or a radio?
Super. That's really important. I used to work for the BBC, and sometimes people would come to my radio studio and they'd say, "Where's the television camera?" Because I told them it was radio, but they just hadn't really thought about that, and they just thought, "Oh, BBC must be television." No, not on that occasion. So good. Right, let's hear some more over here. When will it be released? Great. So either when will it be broadcast, or when will it be in the paper or magazine or online? Very good. You had a lot of that thing. They've got one there. Okay, very good. Any more over here? Good. Any more? Yes.
Policies on editing and editorial control.
Editorial control. That's an interesting one. That would be lower down my list. It's very rare that you would actually be given any editorial control yourself, actually. But
I want to know what it is.
Knowing what it is, okay, that's fine.
Because
You have a legal training.
If the policy is one that's going to allow them to just take sound snaps out of context,
Sure.
I'm not going to feel comfortable with that.
Okay.
If I have some assurance and if I ask a question, then they know what I'm asking and why.
That's a very good point. I think there's another question you could also ask, which is, are you going to be taking this out of context and taking bits and not playing the whole thing? And I think that's a legitimate question, by the way. Now, I think that's an important one for you, not because that means you're turning the interview down, but if you are told that you're going to be interviewed for a period of time and then it's going to be clicked. What's that going to mean for you?
I'm going to look for pithy statements.
You're going to be pithy.
Yeah.
You're going to be pithy. You're not going to ramble on because it won't be used. So I think the knowledge can be useful in a number of ways. It may also be that you withdraw from the interview because it's not the right time for you. But even if you are going to take part, I think it's different. Now, you asked a question at the back there about timing. There are two timing questions. There's a timing you brought up over there about, when you're going to go on. But there's also a timing question, which is about how long. How long do you want from me? Maybe the answer to that is 20 minutes. But the other question is, how long is this going to be when it's finally released to a more wider audience? So in radio terms or television terms, this would be, how long is it going to be on the air? Is it going to be 3 minutes on the air, but you're going to interview me for 20? Is it going to be 3 minutes recorded, but you're going to use it for 30 seconds in the news? These are good questions because it helps you in your head to think, okay, I now know what this is going to sound like when it's finished. So I can then help the journalists get to that point really quickly. And if they don't have to do much editing because you have actually responded to that knowledge, they are much more likely to use your material. If you ramble on, but you kind of know it's going to be 30 seconds and yet you still rambled on, it may well be you never find your way on the air at all. So it helps to put the context in the right frame of mind when you're doing the interview. And I've got a few other questions which I've listed. I've split them into two parts. And one of them would actually be, what's the name of the person who's approached you? And how can you get back in touch with them? So why don't you have their phone and email? Because it may well be you want to get back into touch with them to give them a bit of extra information before the interview. Or you may want to cancel the interview. Because you've got something come up, or you've got to go pick up the kids from school, or sorts of reasons why you can't do things that you said you could do. You did cover this. Where's it going to be published? What's going to happen? We talked about the importance for journalists of working to deadlines. And so knowing what their deadline is very, very important. If a journalist says they'd like to interview you, and you know their deadline is 5 o'clock this afternoon, then you're going to have to work around that, otherwise it simply isn't going to happen. There's no point in you saying, yeah, I can see you at 6. So that's a really important question, and that actually shows, again, a bit of courtesy and a bit of a wider knowledge that you've got, that journalists do work to deadlines. That's what they do all the time. Who is the audience? Very good. I love the fact you brought that up. That's made my day. That's fantastic. What do they actually want? Are they after a single quote? Do they want a spokesperson? Do they need to talk to the boss? That there will be a reason. That's your question about why are you interviewing me? That's a really good one. And part of that is also the context, or the angle, as is sometimes described as, or the hook or peg. The fact that there is a hook, by the way, hook or peg, I should just explain. That means the reason that this interview is taking place today. So if you're being interviewed now today, what is the reason for that? There has to be a reason. Why is it today and not yesterday? And that's particularly important for broadcast interviews, because topicality and timing is very important. So the context, the reason, now there'll be a reason for every interview taking place. I suspect a lot of the things that you do with the media, then the context will be the SDGs and everything that's happening between now and the end of the year. But that may not be enough, there may be more than that. And you need to ask them. The other one is about whether other people are involved, and that might be other people who they have spoken to before, and that's quite a useful thing to know just in case you need to fit your views into the context of other people's views. For example, if you work with another organization and you have similar outlook online, if they have already spoken to another organization, you need to know that, because it means that you can differentiate the message you got from the message they've already got from someone else. So it just starts to build up the context. So, I've asked you to think of 5. Here we've got more than 5, and this isn't the complete list. I've got a few other things I want to add to this list. So,
as NGOs, we are representing an organization. So I would like to know what the impact on our organization is not negatively impacted to make sure.
That partly comes back to the point you were making earlier, Vicky. It's about, what's the purpose of the interview and how does it fit into the broader perspective. I think that's a good one. You will normally, if you have a good rapport with journalists, you normally know that in advance anyway. But that's a good one too.
What about asking for a final edit before it is published?
Yeah, you won't get it.
You won't get it.
Because the journalist's job is to do that for their audience, and you are simply part of that process. You have to trust them to do that. That's I'm afraid, you're going to have to let go.
Okay.
Yeah.
One
One more, hang on a minute, I'll come to you in a minute. No, it's okay.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead, but what if you're misquoted? What do you do? Does that get angry?
Okay, it depends on how bad the misquote is. If it is a factual error which is significant, well, again, it depends. I know people who feel they've been taken out of context because there hasn't been enough detail given. Then we're right the way back to the fact that there may not be time for the detail. So the question is, are you going to be there at all, or are you going to be just completely ignored? Because there isn't time to go into the huge amount of detail. So part of it is honing your message sufficiently that it'll be so simple and easy to understand you can't be taken out of context. So that it's a little bit more complicated than what you suggested. But if that does happen and there's a complete factual misrepresentation which is essential to correct, then you're going to have to get onto the editor. You're going to have to get back to them and say, we've been misrepresented here, and it's very damaging. Now, actually, I find that that's not quite so common. I think what tends to happen is that there's a slightly different slant on a message which has been slightly misunderstood by the journalist. Could be deliberately, or it could be just by accident. And that's where people get cross, but there's not much you can do about that, because you don't want to try and rectify something which is a small change in tone, even if you wish it hadn't happened. So this is why the rapport and the relationship you have with the journalist becomes important, because the more you do have that, the more that they will actually try not to misrepresent you, because they do understand you better. I'm not saying it's evil, though. You had another point you want to make over here.
No, it's past.
You passed it, I was too late.
Great, okay. I've got a couple of really practical questions I want to add to my list of questions for the journalists. So these are really, really practical ones. Where is it going to happen? And again, I've had experience where people have gone to the wrong building. So don't do that. Do double check, where it's going to take place. And the timing, obviously. We talked about how long will it take, how long will it be broadcast, and is it for those different types of media? Whoops, let me just go back a step. So that gives us quite a long list of questions. Now, I'm not suggesting that that would take much time. I am suggesting that if you're unsure of any of those, then that could be problematical for your preparation. So I am suggesting it's good to get into your head that you do need to ask questions of journalists. And that might come as a bit of a surprise to you, because I suspect you thought the journalists are doing all the asking. But they're not. It's a partnership. So they're going to ask you questions about things, and then if you're going to actually be interviewed by them, you kind of know the context that they're coming from as well. And that should make you feel more in control. And control is a large part of this. So I want to give you some examples of preparing. Apart from asking questions of the journalist, what else might you do to actually prepare for an interview before it happens?
Read some of the articles or watch some of the interviews of that particular journal.
Okay, so you do your research, do your homework. Very good. Yeah. What about the content of the interview on this occasion? Good. So again, make sure you know your subject. Good. Make sure you've written down your key messages. What are the three main things you want to make sure that they understand, or remember, or do?
That's what I was going to say.
Good. Oh, sorry, I took it out of your hand. Yeah. But yeah, this whole idea of what does the audience simplify it. A very good point was made in this room in April by somebody who was sitting over here by the door, and he said, from his experience as a journalist, it's important to let you know that you're going to be simplifying your messages and taking things out all the time when you're interviewed by journalists. Whereas for a lot of the work that you would do where you're writing reports, you show your authority and the experience you've got by putting things in. When you're writing, you're adding more and more. In fact, the longer the report sometimes, the more important it looks. The opposite is true, I think, actually, about written stuff, but it's also definitely untrue. It's not going to be true of interviews. you're going to be having very simple messages, very clear, with good examples. That's what really works.
When we say also simplify the message,
Yeah.
but also the language. Because
Yes.
we're used to using certain jargon, and many people out there don't know.
I'm going to show you some examples of jargon to add today, because I think that's such an important point you make. And part of it is, again, coming back to this idea of the audience, the message, the medium, and the language, and how they interact. So if the audience is a general audience and the medium is, say, radio, you're going to need to change your language. Yeah. So we'll come back to jargon a bit later on. A couple of other things you can do to prepare for an interview, not just your topic. I mean, you can practice. I put that on the board there. Practice with a colleague or a friend. If you're going to be interviewed and it's going to be recorded, why don't you just have a quick go at one of your friends, imagining they're being a journalist, and ask you some questions about this topic. You know what the topic is because you asked the journalist what the topic was, and so now that you know that, just practice talking it through. Don't learn it as a script, but practice it and try and make sure you get your key messages through. So thinking of the three main things you'd want the audience to do or remember or understand. Now, preparing useful phrases I think is very helpful. I did just a moment ago say, please don't learn a script. I think that is important. Don't learn a script. If you learn a script and you just come out with a script, it will make you sound very unengaging. And that isn't going to be very interesting to anybody. People just will glaze over. But useful phrases can be very helpful. And I always think of them alongside examples as being the things you need to have in your pocket. You need to have these things ready to go, so that in the course of a conversational interview, which is what it would be if it's being recorded, what you're doing is you're being able to draw on examples or draw on certain phrases which you have practiced a little bit, and you know it's a really quick and sharp way of describing your organization, what it does, and the way it makes the world a better place. And those can be very short phrases, but they can be ones you know work. You may have found that in talking to family members or friends who don't work in this area, so they don't know what you do, you may have found there are certain phrases which you can use when you have a relative who says, so what do you do? You may have found there are things you can say where they understand because you've used that phrase once and you saw that it worked. Anybody got an example of that? Any phrases they've used where they've been explaining their work to other people? We all get asked what we do, don't we? Anybody found a way of doing that? I've got some examples I'll put up on the board for you. Part of it is remembering to be human. Yes?
In one interview where you were on a pipeline going, I was interviewed, I said, master this sector down to us. This is our home. We want to serve for the next generation.
There you go. That's a really good example of a prepared phrase, which is, it has some...
It was, broadcast.
Yeah, I'm sure it would be. Because it's short, it's clear, and it showed some human emotion. And that kind of thing can work really, really well. So I think preparing those sorts of things are quite helpful. And you can stack them up, because they're not full sentences very often. They don't come across as learning a script and just parroting the script. But examples, I think of it sometimes like this. I guess you know this guy, Robin Hood. And do you know what he's wearing on his back? It's a quiver. It's a quiver full of arrows. And the reason I'm showing you this is that I think you can have a quiver of phrases and examples, yeah? So on your back, you've got a quiver not full of arrows, but it's full of phrases and examples. And then at a certain part in the interview, you whip your hand over and stick, there you go, there's the phrase. I've got some examples for you which just are very, very broad examples, because I don't know what you do in sufficient detail to be able to narrow them right way down. But something like, your organization's main aim is to do this. In fact, the example you just gave me was very like that. I was talking to someone who was affected by this, and what they said was, now then you have a real example right there. So one way of you making your examples in your interviews much more human is to talk about real people that you come across in the course of your work who are going to be affected by what you do. We've helped more than 2,000 people to whatever, I mean, again, I'm thinking of just generally ways of having a phrase which just helps to portray the fact that you're active and doing good stuff. there'll be different phrases that each of you could use for your organisation, but you're trying to capture very, very quickly what it is you do. You do not want to suddenly be thinking, oh my God, what does my organisation really do? I haven't really thought of that. That would be a bad sort of interview to be in, wouldn't it? Where you have to think too hard. And I have a colleague who has the phrase in his head all the time that if you're doing an interview with a journalist, that is not the time for original thought. Which I thought was a very interesting way of putting it. I like that very much. But I think what you're doing here is you're preparing a certain sort of construction by putting the phrases and the examples together and keeping them tidy in your quiver so that you can pull them out at any point. Let's give you an example. This is a real example from an interview that I did in some training, which is about healthcare. And this was what the person said first. We did 2 interviews, and the first interview was full of this kind of language. And he said the main thrust of this work is to help hospitals work more efficiently by involving frontline staff. Okay, so this is spoken word. This is not in print. This is how he responded to one of the questions we did as we were practicing being interviewed. Now, there are a couple of things in that which are a bit problematic. And one of them is there isn't an example. He talked about hospitals working more efficiently, and all of us would agree that hospitals, if they can work efficiently, that's a good thing. But it isn't enough. So I'm going to show you how, by just expanding a little bit, in the second time we did the interview, he came up with this. We know hospitals can work more efficiently. For example, in the north of the country, doctors and nurses at one hospital got together and analysed what happens when older patients arrive for treatment. They looked at every part of the process. As a result, 30% more patients were sent home within the day. The changes saved £3.2 million across a year. Now, I realise that's a lot longer, but actually, what they've done there is they've just taken the first one and they've put it into real human language. Not least, can you see the phrase at the top there, frontline staff?
It's very technical.
It is very technical, and this organisation is a health think tank. It's a health policy think tank. What do they turn frontline staff into? Doctors and nurses. Now we're talking, because that's what people really call, isn't it? Another example from this one would be more efficiently. I said more efficiently. That sounds great. Let's work more efficiently, but actually it doesn't give you any flavour. There's no texture to that phrase. Yeah, exactly. So we've got 30% more patients were sent home, and the changes saved £3.2 million. So the more efficiently has been translated now into 2 different factors. Now you could argue they didn't need to go into quite so much detail in the second example, but that's what we mean when we're talking about things like real language, being human, engaging, and also key messages. Because your key messages can be part of these examples. A key message might be, I must really ensure that during this interview, the audience understands an example of what efficiently means. And that might be 30% more patients.
So also, how you expand that in the video.
Definitely.
Because to me, you're doing this to either government or investors, because you're focusing on what you save as much money, as opposed to saving lives. Having worked in hospitals in my whole professional career,
sure.
So be a different audience.
The context for this was actually the public healthcare in the UK and the fact that the taxpayer is being asked to spend less money on the national health service. So I agree with you, the audience context and everything does make a difference. But for this, what they were doing was trying to make sure that they were talking in a more human way, and that was one of the things that they did. I'm not saying it's completely perfect, but it's an example of how you can move from one to the other quite quickly.
Yeah.
So that's part of your preparation. Now, another person that you'll hear in the podcasts online is this person who used to be another journalist. She works now at the International Labour Organization, which is a UN body, and is based in Geneva. Her name is Marcia Poole, and I asked her some questions from podcasts about what it's like being interviewed, what would she suggest some of the things to think about. Now, she's given lots of tips in the podcasts, which you'll hear alongside all the other speakers that I interviewed.
You need to emphasize the positive. What can be done? What can be done? It's so dreary that why should I bother? Why should I care? There's nothing I can do about it. It was a bit like this if you think about the climate change debate, when people just felt, look, it's terrible. There's nothing we can do to change the situation. So you need to focus on the human. You know, tell the human story and the impact you're having on people's lives. And secondly, the positive impact. What can be achieved? What can be done? Rather than the tragedy, the misery, etc.
So that's an important point, and in fact it came up earlier on with our colleague who's sitting in the corner here, who said it's easy to frighten people. It's easy to frighten people, and actually general audiences particularly, you don't want to frighten them, you want to engage with them. You want to involve them in the discussion. And one of the ways of doing that is emphasise the positive. Whether that means talking about how successful some of the SDGs have been in the past as a way of saying, look, we know this sort of thing can work. That may be part of this for you. But that's Marcia. That's one of the things she was talking about. Interviews have certain dynamics to them, by the way, and so she talked about the positivity that's so useful as a way of engaging other people when they're listening. I wanted to share with you some thoughts on how interviews can work, and part of it is positivity, but part of it is to really underline how much it's a conversation. If you're going to be part of an interview with a journalist, particularly radio and television interviews, then it's a conversation, it's not a lecture. You're not there to lecture them about everything about the subject you're an expert in. You're there to engage with them and just convince them about the importance of the work that you do in a human way. And one of the best ways of doing that is to imagine, again, you're talking to a friend or a relative who doesn't know much about what you're doing, and use that kind of language. That can work really, really well. It's not a performance, it's actually quite intimate. So you're not talking to more than one person at a time. You're actually just talking to that one person. If they've got technology, like a microphone, you ignore it, and you just look at them. And that works really well. It's one-on-one, it's not lots of people. Don't forget you're the experts. A lot of people go in rather nervously to talk to a journalist, thinking they're on the receiving end of something. Actually, it's the other way around. You're the expert, you've got the knowledge, that's why they've asked you. That gives you some authority. Explain things calmly, use ordinary language, but be succinct, don't ramble on. This may take a little bit of practice, but it helps you then, when you're being interviewed, to keep up a steady rhythm. And by rhythm, what I'm really talking about there is that there should be some kind of toing and froing, but it's not them doing all the talking, but it's not you doing all the talking either. So it should feel more like a conversation. An interview for media purposes should feel like a conversation, and it should go from one to the other. I actually decided to try and demonstrate this for you by playing some rhythms to you. I thought that'd be a good thing to do at 5:30. Play some rhythms, you see. So here we are. This is an example of the sort of thing that could be a rhythm for an interview. Okay, so it's answer, question, answer, 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 question, answer, 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 question, answer, 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 question, answer, 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 question. Yes? Let's read it quick. Yeah, you obviously don't do it that quick. But it's that, I mean, stretch that a little bit, if you don't mind. But if you don't do that, and there isn't that feeling of it being a conversation where there's a rhythm to it, it can sound a little bit like this. And that is just a little bit too edgy. That's just a bit too edgy. So interviews need to feel a bit smoother than that. So if that helps you with the rhythm, I mean, sometimes I talk to people, they're so nervous when they do an interview that what they do is they just give a very short sentence and then shut up, or they're so nervous they talk forever. And they won't, you know, they won't go quiet because they just feel they have to fill 3 minutes without any interruption. That's not the rhythm of an interview. An interview is much more like two people having a chat. And so think about rhythm where they're both involved. I've got a chart for you. I realise this might be a little bit over the top, but I think it's important that you think of an interview. If you have a timeline going from the left to the right, they're on board. And then over this side, we have the energy and dynamism of an interview. I think actually we can compare that with a conversation. And I think this is where there is a difference. So all I'm saying, interviews are like conversations. Media interviews normally are quite short. They might be a few minutes. Now, as a result of that, they behave in a slightly different way. So I'm going to show you, first of all, on here, an idea of the dynamism of, or the energy levels of a conversation. So when you meet somebody and you say hi, there's usually a bit of a slow start. You look at each other, you smile, you have a bit of eye contact. You say, hi, what's your name? You introduce yourself, and then you move into the subject. And they say, so what do you do? And then you talk with some dynamism and energy about what you do, and then it trails off, and you kind of run out of things to say, and the time's gone, and then one of you says, sorry, got to go, and that's it. So it can work like that quite commonly, a conversation about what you do. Short conversation. Interviews cannot work like that, because interviews have to have energy from the start. So if you're preparing for an interview, you've got to remember that it's got to start with higher energy than you might expect when the first question is asked. So an interview, which is the darker line, starts with more energy than you would normally feel comfortable with. That grabs the attention of the listener. So it grabs the journalist's attention, but it also grabs the attention of anybody who's listening in. And it also ends on a high. In fact, the ending, I feel, is that end part of an interview is a very important part of an interview. As the interview finishes, you're trying to leave the listener with a feeling of energy and optimism. So I call this bit at the end, I call it the feel-good zone. It's the last part of an interview. If this was 3 minutes from start to finish, you'd want to end with a warm tish at the end there, which means that you don't ramble on and just forget to say some stuff at the end and it all falls apart, but you end up thinking, okay, what would be the thing I would want the audience to be left with here? Now I think this, it's maybe a bit esoteric, this chart, but the number of times that I've heard interviews where they've gone wrong because they started or ended too slow. They've just run out of steam at the end. The best ones are where the person who's explaining things grabs the attention at the beginning and the end. And conversations don't tend to work that way. So this is a difference that you're going to have to think about. Now in energy levels, what I mean there also is perhaps, well, what does it mean for you? I mean, if you're going to be interviewed, what does this mean, do you think, for you?
I actually, yeah, because it reminded me of something I did a few months ago. I ended it with the punchline.
Yeah, it's like a punchline.
Something about the empowerment of women, and then kind of watched myself talking, and then just finished it with that. And it energized me too, because I wanted to make sure the main message was in the interview.
You can make one of your key messages also part of that end point. Yeah. It really works well. So that's a great way of thinking of it. I think the difficulty can be at the beginning. I think there are two difficulties, but one is at the beginning. If it involves you grabbing attention from the start, how do you get that energy? How are you going to do this? Think parts.
Have a coffee.
Have a coffee. I mean, we are talking about really physical things. We're talking about, you know, just making sure that you kind of stretch a bit before you get interviewed. Make sure you're awake. Yeah. It's a responsibility you have to your audience, I think.
Get keyed up.
Yeah, you get keyed up. And then you will probably know what the first question will be. You have a pretty good idea what the first question will be, because the journalist is likely to give an indication as to the kind of things that come up first. So that helps you, but then you prepare for that. So it means that you're not completely caught off guard at the beginning. Away you go, and then the problem at the end is sometimes you don't know when the end is. But actually, you do, don't you? Why do you know when the end's going to be now? You ask them. You ask them how long it was going to be. So you've got to watch, or you can keep an eye on the time, or you just get a feeling for how much you're going to pack in. That means that as your time runs out, you can think, this feels like we're coming to the end, and then you do what you did, which is a perfect example. So I don't want to linger too long on this, but I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, is this dynamic of an interview. Even with very difficult subjects, this dynamic can work. This is Fiona Callister, who works for WaterAid in the UK, but she used to work for Catholic. Upsetting subjects in a way where people will remain engaged. Now she has a view on this, and I'm going to play it to you.
One element of that story is, well, how do you help those children to cope? One of the things that Catholic used to do is by creating memory boxes. So the parent who has HIV is working with the child to sort of put things in a box which help encapsulate memories of that child. Personally, I think that's quite a poignant way of illustrating a bigger issue. So, it could be something as small as, the first T-shirt that the child ever wore or something. But in that, you're helping show the journey that a family is going to make, show the input of your organisation in helping to organise this and working with parents and children to, from the counselling point of view. I think that people can then have that human connection.
So she's talking about a situation where communities have had real difficulty with the adults dying of HIV and lots of orphan children. She was talking about how you can actually talk about things that give you, and this is important, that people can have a human connection. And the human connection that one talks about in interviews usually gives the interview energy. So energy can come through really good examples, even with a difficult subject like that. It can come through with really good examples and really engage the audience. And engage the journalists as well, because they're a human being too. So human connection, very, very important. Got another example of someone who's done this, actually. This is a very old example from a former Prime Minister in the UK, who does something else where he introduces an example into, now this is not an interview, this really is a presentation, but the technique that he uses is worthy of note, because what he does is he talks about an enormous subject, and then he grounds it by using an example of someone he's met. So, how does it?
And take the partnership we need between our countries and the rest of the world, the poorest part of the world. We do not have the basis of a proper partnership for the future. And yet, out of people's desire for a global ethic and a global society, that can be done. I've just been talking to the president of Sierra Leone. This is a country, 6.5 million people, but it has only 18 doctors. It has 200 nurses. It has 120 midwives. You cannot begin to build a healthcare system for 6 million people with such limited resources. Or take the girl I met when I was in Tanzania, a girl called Miriam. She was 11 years old. Her parents had both died from AIDS, a mother and then a father. She was an AIDS orphan being handed across different extended families to be cared for. She herself was suffering from HIV. She was suffering from tuberculosis. I met her in a field. She was ragged. She had no shoes. When you looked in her eyes, any girl at the age of 11 is looking forward to the future. But there was an unreachable sadness in that girl's eyes. And if I could have translated that to the rest of the world for that moment, I believe that all the work that is done for the global HIV/AIDS fund would be rewarded by people being prepared to make donations. But we must then build a proper relationship between the richest and the poorest countries based on our desire that they are able to fend for themselves with the investment that is necessary in their agriculture so that Africa is not a net importer of food, but Africa is a net exporter of food. And take the problems of human rights.
So, what he's done there is he's taken a very, very big subject. In fact, that's the subject of his TED talk. And what he's tried to do is to bring it down to the human level. Now, to a certain extent, when people do that, it can sound a little bit cliche. I met someone the other day. And sometimes they haven't, and you can tell. But he, I think, had, and you can tell that too. And the thing you've got, which actually I think is true of nearly everybody I work with in the area I do media training, which is charities, NGOs, is you've got plenty of examples to pull on, actually. Because a lot of your work is all about this. It's all about making a difference in people's lives. So use those examples. If you meet people along the course of your work, then don't be afraid to use the examples when you're talking about your work, because they will ground the subject. Rather than making it seem really flighty, it starts to make sense of it. And you can use them by saying, well, the big issues are this, and for example, this and this and this. That works pretty well. So you can still talk about the big issues, but you don't talk about them in isolation. That's one of the best examples I've seen of someone doing that. And he also feels very passionately about the work he's done in this area. So that also comes through. And I always say to people, don't be afraid to show your passion, because the passion for the work you have will be very engaging. It's very human. And so when you're being interviewed, showing the passion will be very, very powerful. So a couple of other things about being interviewed. Don't learn scripts. Yeah, don't learn scripts. But do learn phrases. Do mention the name of your organisation. So when someone says, what have you been doing? Don't say, oh, we've been doing this. Say, we at the organisation that you work for have been doing this. What's the name of the organisations you work for? Give me an example of a name or two.
International Presentation Association.
International Presentation Association. Okay, so if someone was talking to you about that, you wouldn't just say, ah, well, we've been working in this area in New York. You'd say, well, we at the International Presentation Association. Because if you don't mention your organisation's name, no one else will. And it's so important to raise the profile of the organisation you work with in that way. It's an easy one to get to do. It's also easy to forget to do it. Don't do too many statistics. I know we've just seen a clip where Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, did use a lot of statistics. But in broadcast interviews, statistics don't work very well. The audience generally just hears very large or very small. That's what they hear. They don't hear the individual figure. So if you're using statistics, use them really carefully. But bear in mind that they can be just used to show that something's very big or very small, but not really in any huge detail. Talk about real people, I think we've made that point. Engage the interviewer. Don't think about the technology, just engage the interviewer. Keep an eye on that. And above all, don't be afraid to be yourself. You don't have to pretend to be anybody else, because that's also very human. It's very engaging to hear the real you. And that comes a little bit with confidence, but also with practicing and keeping your phrases. So any questions about that aspect before we play a couple of other examples to finish off with? Any questions about anything we've said there about being interviewed? Good. Okay, oops, we don't need a volunteer. We're going to talk about difficult questions. Has anyone ever had a difficult question from an interview? What kind of difficult questions might you have if you're being interviewed? What constitutes a difficult question? Okay, could be controversy, yeah.
Something embarrassing to yourself or your organization.
Could be embarrassing, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that can be the case. I mean, I've got a list here of difficult areas or difficult questions. Sometimes a difficult question just can be unexpected. It's not that it's contentious, it's just that you hadn't expected it. So that can be something that's difficult to deal with. We'll talk about how to deal with all of these in a minute. Sometimes the questions are just wrong questions because the journalist is ignorant. And I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean they can't know everything. You're the expert, not them. They maybe ask you a question which is just off the mark, or irrelevant, if you want to put it that way, and awkward, which is the ones that you came up with. Now, I think that there are some techniques which we need to talk about in dealing with these questions, just in case they come along. And there's one I want to share with you today. It's a very commonly used technique. You'll hear people using it a lot, particularly politicians, but they can be used in the same way if you're working in the areas you work in. And it's called bridging. So if you're getting a tricky question, you can bridge from the question. Now, there is an ABC here, which I'm going to share with you. This is very common. Any media trainer would recognize this. A, B, and C. The first thing to do if you're asked a tricky question is to acknowledge that you've been asked the question. So you don't ignore it completely. You say yes, or you acknowledge the question in some form. And I'm going to show you some phrases in a minute which do this. Then you bridge from the question to one of your key messages. And you take control. So that's the C. So the A is acknowledge, the B is bridge, and the C is control. Now, let me show you some of the phrases that can be used to do this. You will have heard some people using these, I suspect, but here's one. So let's imagine you've been asked a difficult question for whatever reason that is difficult. You can say, that's a great question. But what we're really concerned about in this organization is, and then you talk about one of your key messages. Now that's acknowledging the question, bridging across, and then controlling by talking about one of your key messages. And in a 3 or 4 minute interview, you want to make sure that you're getting your key messages across. So being bogged down in a question which isn't relevant or is particularly off-beam is not going to help you. So that's one way of doing it. Here's a couple of other phrases for you. Difficult question, that's true, but the really important issue today is, and then you talk about the key thing you want to talk about. Here's another one. Let me emphasize a point once again. And then you go back to the point you made earlier, which is one of your key messages. That may or may not be the case, but my expertise is in this area. This is when you're asked a question where you don't actually know the answer. And you don't have to pretend you do. If you don't know the answer, don't pretend you know the answer. Just say, well, actually, that's for someone else. But what we really want to talk about is this. A bridge through to the question that you want to answer. Some people say this makes them feel fraudulent because they're not answering the question. Well, my response to that is you don't want to answer all the questions because some of them are too difficult to answer. Or they're just the wrong question. They're silly, or ignorant, or irrelevant. Last one. That's important, and definitely a question for somebody else, but, you know, and then you talk about the thing you're good at. So this is definitely where the wrong person's been asked. You weren't the right person for that question. So what do you make of those? Do they make sense? Yeah?
You sound like politicians.
Well, yeah. I take that as true and partly a criticism. But the reason politicians do it is because they don't want to answer the questions sometimes. They don't want to be pinned down. That's not the reason you're doing it. The reason you're doing it is the question was either one you didn't know the answer to, or it was the wrong question, or you were the wrong person, or whatever. So there's legitimate reasons for real people like you to do this as well.
Is it awkward to admit honestly that I'm not an expert in this particular?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I think that's good, actually. Because what you're saying is, ask me any question you like in the area I know, but I can't answer questions in the area I don't. And you're doing it politely and quickly. But then what you do is you move quickly into an area where you do know, and that's the bridging element. So it's not just a question of acknowledging and saying, don't ask me that. You're saying, I acknowledge that, but actually what I really like to talk about, and then you move it on. So the conversation keeps going. Yeah.
Maybe this is because I'm not doing the first snack things like that. But if something really that's great, but what we're concerned about something else, I say, well, if it's so great, why do you answer the question? Do you feel like that's?
No, I tell you what.
You're saying it's like, well, that's actually important, but I don't care about it.
No, you should in your answer be giving an obvious reason why you're not going to answer that question. I live in Old England, we're a bit snappy. It's true. I think don't feel apologetic about answering the questions you can answer and not answering the questions you can't answer. I think that would just undermine the point of the interview. And the journalists very often realize they've asked the wrong question. I've been in a case where I've asked someone a question and they've been the wrong one, and they've actually put me right by doing this and brought me back on track, and it's been a better interview as a result. No one wants a rubbish interview.
I was going to follow up on that. You sort of answered a little bit. As a journalist, if I'm using any of these things, what doesn't lead you to think, as Jeff said, that we are being a politician or I'm trying to avoid the answer? What stops whatever you produce from saying something negative about me or my organization? Yes, I didn't.
It's not negative not to know the answer to every question. That's the first thing. That's not a negative thing. You can't be an expert on absolutely everything. But you can be an expert on the thing that you can talk about. Now, obviously, if it's a question which is fundamental to the topic and you don't know the answer, you haven't done your homework properly. And you have every right to feel bad about that. But if you're asked a question which is just not relevant to the topic, or is off-beam, or takes you down a road that you can't go, there's nothing wrong with saying that's taking me down a road I can't go, so bringing it back. I don't have a problem with that. I've been a journalist.
No, I know, that's what I was asking. Because
I'm not there to catch you out. This is the thing. The journalist isn't there to catch you out unless you've had your hand in the till.
Work for Fox News or the Daily News, where that is the impression. that you, when you read
Even on Fox News, it won't be every interview is designed to catch you out, particularly if they're interviewing you. Because if they interview you about what you're doing, they're going to want to pick different elements of it. Yeah, and you're going to know that in advance and do your homework. This is still a technique. That's a really good point to bring up. But having been a journalist in that position, sometimes it's because the interview was running into the ground because I took it down the wrong track. And that's not a good interview, actually. It doesn't help me, it doesn't help the audience. So use with care. I would hate it if all your interview questions were answered like this, because that would make it sound like you were trying to evade all the issue. Certainly not the point I'm making. I'm saying this is something you can do in extremis, when things get really tough for some reason, but I don't think you'll have to use them very often. Let's have a couple more examples to finish with. I promised some jargon stuff. I've just put up 4 pieces of jargon which I love, or hate, depending on which way you look at it. We have stakeholder, with or without a hyphen. We have empowerment, and we have nexus, and we have modalities. My friend at Civicus, we were having lunch before this session, I almost kissed him, sorry Ollie, when as part of the conversation he had with one of his colleagues, he used the word modalities. Because it's a word I never hear anywhere in the real world. What does it mean?
Jeff told me that.
What does modalities actually mean? I mean, what word could you use instead? Methods, the process, the ways of doing things, the ways, yeah. Yeah, well, there's lots of jargon that's used all over the place in different areas, because what I'm talking about is taking the language out of the specialism, the point you were making so well, and then talking to a wider audience that may not understand it. So I'm just going to obviously, I'm going to say don't do this. I'm going to just play you a couple of examples of problems with jargon. And this is another one from Marcia, the person who works at the International Labour Organization. She's worked for Amnesty International and other organizations, as well as being a journalist for many, many years. But a couple of problems with jargon, I thought I'd let her explain.
Sometimes, things like, for example, another I'm thinking about, in our case, forced labor. Forced labor is a particular term which encompasses anything from modern day slavery to human trafficking to bondage and etc. So of course, if we're writing a report that's going to be presented to the UN Human Rights Council, we'll use precise legal language. But if I'm writing for something for a website, or I'm going to go on a HuffPost or Reddit or Google Hangout or whatever, then we talk about slavery rather than forced labor.
So what she's talking about is what we talked about at the beginning of the day. It's a very good way of putting it, I think, giving the example of forced labor versus the word slavery, and where you would use one, not the other. So for you, you'd be in a position where some of the things you're talking about, some of the ways you talk within this building, will be perfectly understandable, and probably very precise. But when you take it outside, you've got to use language people use in everyday life, and this can make people feel misquoted. But actually what you're trying to do is to engage the audience in a way where they can understand the issues, rather than absolutely the detail, right down to the last nugget. I think someone else actually who's an old colleague of mine, I used to work with the BBC, and he now runs the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in London. I used to be an environment correspondent as well, and he also is very interesting on podcasts, talking about different aspects of talking to the media, because he's seen it from both sides, just as Marcia has.
There was a study done fairly recently in the UK, actually, where they went out, the particular organisation went out and looked at this, and looked at how words are misunderstood. One that sticks in my mind very strongly is the word mitigation, which is often used in climate change terms. And when people use it in climate change terms, it basically means reducing emissions. But actually, a lot of people understand it to mean what climate specialists mean when they say adaptation. Because when you use the word mitigate in ordinary speech, it's sort of to reduce a threat or something like this, to reduce an issue. So if you're, for example, building flood defense barriers, you are, in ordinary language, mitigating the flood risk. But in climate change jargon terms, you are adapting. So it's really important, and the words, they're full of this. I mean, for example, you talk about energy efficiency. Now, to most people, what we're talking about is cutting energy waste. One talks about biodiversity and ecosystems. Why not talk about nature, wildlife? That's actually what we mean.
So think about what we mean. I put it on board. Think about what we actually mean. Biodiversity, talk about animals or flora or nature. And the context of an interview will give you the right words. It makes you more precise, and to a certain extent it makes you more broad in other aspects of this, but it makes it more engaging. It also makes you sound like a real human being, which helps. Got a small exercise to share with you, just to finish on the jargon front. There's obviously a lot more about jargon online on the SD2015.org website with everything else. I thought this was a fascinating example of jargon. It actually comes from a press release, and this is real. I'll just read it out for you if I can. A multi-stakeholder partnership has released the first ever comprehensive narrative on global health and country level progress towards reducing malnutrition everywhere. It was compiled to create a one-stop composite of the often fragmented and disparate information available on global nutrition, and to fill some of the critical gaps in knowledge and data collection. Now, I have great difficulty actually working out what that means, but it's taken a while to try to unpick it. Why don't you point out to me some of the jargon words that we would want to try and avoid there? Okay, we got multi-stakeholder. Excellent. Multi-stakeholder. What do we really mean by multi-stakeholder? Many nations or organizations. We don't actually know, of course, because it's too jargony. We don't know what it really means, but it's a number of organizations. Yeah? More than one organization. Obviously, they're a partnership, and obviously, if they're doing work in this area, they must have a stake in it. So they're obviously stakeholders. So we remove that and we just say a number of organizations. Very good. Okay. More? First ever. I'm glad you picked up on that. A narrative stands out, I agree. First ever, I think, is a bit of a problem there. No one ever talks like that.
How could you be sure?
And why, yes.
My first ever wedding.
Yeah. It's just weird. I agree, narrative. What does narrative mean?
Story.
It means, well, yes, it does. In this context, I'm not quite sure if that's really what we mean. Narrative here just means a report or description, and so it isn't really needed. And you find that a lot of jargon, you can just get rid of it. It just doesn't have to be there. Lovely comprehensive report, it'd be fine. Country level progress. I mean, some of this stuff, you look at the individual words, you think, well, they're all right. And then you put them together and you think, that means nothing. By talking about a number of countries and how progress has been made, it starts to sound much more like a real thing. This is one of my favorites. One-stop composite. Created a one-stop composite. I have no idea how to rewrite that. I think just remove it.
Repository.
Yeah, a report, give it back to just a report, which helps us understand more about the information about, disparate is different information, so do we need, information is by its very nature different, so do we really need it? If it's fragmented, is that important? Well, probably not, even though it's true. A lot of this is true and accurate, but unnecessary. And that's what you need to also strip out. Whenever you're talking about the things you do, whether it's going to be someone you're talking to, or whether it's going to be written in some sort of press release, you're going to need to strip it back. Otherwise, people will just fade. And we finally have critical gaps in knowledge and data collection. That would be things we don't know yet, yeah, isn't it? Almost. Now, I don't want to be too flippant. I mean, I do appreciate that there may be a place for some of this stuff, but I would suggest that the place is not altogether in 2 paragraphs. And that even in a report that you write, if you wrote it like that, you're actually giving a barrier to understanding.
What UN document did you take?
It's not, I think, a UN document, but it is a real press release. It is a real press release, which is it's a good example of how not to do it.
There are certain terms of art, though, that you have to if you're going to be giving commentary or, they call it UN speech. There's certain.
Yeah, of course you're going to have to use some terms if it's the context of something within the organisation or the UN. My point is that that's a barrier to understanding further afield quite quickly. Yeah. Yeah. Again, it comes back to who's the audience, but this doesn't really help. So good. That's a good way to end. So let me just kind of refresh. A couple of things on messages and audiences, which we did earlier on. And what I've done is I've prepared a handout for you, which has the basic points from the first part on the front. And some of you would have seen this from April, or maybe not. But there it is in Technicolor on the front. And it has the information about the website underneath. On the back, we have some more information about the other things we did, which is preparing for interviews, the main points about that, and also the dynamic of interviews, making sure that you realize that it's a conversation with one other person, it's not a performance. I did promise that we would finish on this question, and I do want to finish on this question, which is gauging success. In the last couple of minutes, I've got a question for you. How do you monitor and gauge success? How do you measure that when you engage with the media, it's been successful? Do you have any thoughts on that? What makes it successful? I've got a couple of prompts for you here. We're going to make it successful. Let's think of it in terms of short term, medium term, long term. There we are. I know I can rely on you.
But long term, especially if create a relationship with the journalist and that we can continue the conversation.
Good. So you've got a rapport with journalists you can work together with over a period of time. So that doesn't work very well in short term. I agree with you. That's a good one. Good. Any other examples of short-term success or medium or long-term?
The impact that you have on the people or how the message is received.
Good. So we need to know how does the audience receive it. Now that's for you to work out how you're going to work that out. And who is the audience? How will you be able to tell? Is a very important thing to monitor. So you need to talk to people. You know, did they notice that you've been interviewed? Did they notice that there's been an engagement? You know, those sorts of questions are quite difficult. The answer might be, no, they didn't notice. And that's a hard message for you to take on board. Maybe it was a waste of time, you know. But that's all part of this. You might get it wrong, but you've got to check that, test it. Good. Any others? Yes, there's some other hands up. Yes.
Traffic to a website.
Yes. So you can measure some of this as a result of social media and web stuff. That's a fantastic gauge of whether it's worked or not. So that's a thing we can do now, which we can do before. That's really good. I've got some ideas for you on board.
Also, if you get emails or
Good.
you know, inquiries, whatever it might be about what your organization is or donation.
Perfect. If you're going out for donations, for example, that's one of your key messages, if the donations go up. You have to measure it. That's a really good example. I put the first short-term one as just very short-term. You've done an interview. Did you remember to talk about your 3 key messages? If you forgot them and didn't get them in the interview, you've wasted your time. You know, it hasn't gone as well as it could have done. A couple of other short-term ones. Did the journalists look happy? Or did they look like we've wasted their time? Yeah. And very good that you came up with what did the audience think. I think that's a really, really important one. What did the audience think? Medium term, I would put, did the journalist come back to you? So if you had more than one interview with the journalist, you know, did they come back for a second interview, or did they run for the hills and never want to talk to you again? That would be an indication it hadn't gone quite as well as you wanted. Did you build up a rapport with them? I put that as one of the medium term one, but I agree it could be long term as well. And of course, long term overall, are you getting wider recognition? Do people understand what you do? You know, is perhaps your organisation getting talked about in the right ways, in the right places? Are people noticing you more over time? So, I mean, I think it's important to gauge success. If you don't measure success, you can't tell you're doing well. And also, you can't tell if you're doing badly, and you do need to be honest with yourself about it. Which brings me nicely to the end of the session. I said we finish at 6, I think it's exactly 6. So I will stop there. I'm obviously picking up slowly as we move out of the room. So I'm happy to take questions if you want to ask them, but I would at this stage like to say 2 things. First of all, we have a webinar sometime in September, we think, Ollie. So we'll be able to do a little bit of a hoovering up. And if you're interested in some specific elements of working with media that you want me to address in the webinar, then by all means let me know via these guys at Civicus. But otherwise, we'll be doing about an hour's worth or something on the webinar in September by the looks of things at the moment. We're not exactly sure the date, but we'll work on it. We'll let them know. So that's one thing. The other thing I need to say is don't forget to look at the website, because that's where all the materials are, and the audio, podcasts, and downloads. And that's the website I mentioned at the beginning. If you go to sd2015.org, you then click on Engagement Tools and Media Support. That will get you to the place you need to get to for all the information here. Twice, I'm really grateful. Thank you very much. Really nice to meet you again, and I hope you meet again in the future. Thank you very much.
Oh, we have handouts.
Sorry about that. That's useful.